Okay, good morning, everybody. And this morning, let's carry on our discussion, try and finish our discussion about the immune system. And I finished off with this slide on our last class. And this, of course, is a diagram of the COVID virus. And so let's use this as an opportunity just to say a couple of things about the COVID virus. COVID virus is what is known as an enveloped virus. That means that it has around it here a membrane there. And on the inside, you see the spiral here. This is actually a protein sheath spiraled around nucleic acid. And the nucleic acid in the case of the COVID virus is RNA, ribonucleic acid, not DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, as we have, but instead it is RNA. It's a member of a special class of viruses. Viruses are not living organisms. They are just very, very complicated biochemicals. They're huge biomolecules, very well organized, and they have no metabolism. They have no ability to reproduce on their own. Instead, what they have to do is they have to get this nucleic acid inside a host cell. And once inside the host cell, they commandeer the machine of cellular machinery, and they get the host cell to produce all of the proteins necessary that the virus has to have, produce this protein sheath, and reproduce that nucleic acid thousands of times in a single cell. And then once all of that process is complete, the viruses leave the cell by one means or another. In the case of COVID, they bud out and they're released with a membrane around them like this. Now, we are particularly interested in this membrane because it has embedded in it these viral proteins. They're called, these ones, the pink ones here, are called the spike proteins, simply because they look like spikes. But there are other viral proteins embedded in the membrane there as well. Now, what is important is that this is what the immune system sees. All of these features are on the outside, and they are available for investigation by cells of the immune system that will react to them. So this brings us to this whole question, first of all, of what is the nature of this infection? And then second of all, how is it that our own immune system can react to this? And can we actually use that immune response in order to protect us, especially by production of a vaccine? So first of all, the COVID virus appears to be acquired, first of all, as in the respiratory tract. It is a respiratory virus principally, and it is acquired by droplet inhalation. As we speak, even just as we breathe, without knowing it, we continually produce small droplets from our respiratory tract, which last in the air. They remain suspended in the air for a certain amount of time before they dry out or fall down. But we are continually exhaling a mist of these droplets. And these viral particles are incredibly small. They are very, 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 very much smaller even than a bacterium. And one of these minute droplets that we exhale can contain hundreds, if not thousands, of these viral particles if we ourselves are infected. The COVID virus, however, seems to be able to infect a number of other tissues as well. And the one set of tissues which are of particular concern are cells which line the blood vessels. Go back and have a look, and you'll remember I told you that the blood vessels are lined with these specialized cells called the endothelial cells. And they create a very smooth lining to the inside of the blood vessels so that blood corpuscles and everything pass over them without stopping. If we stop blood corpuscles or of any sort against the sides of the blood vessel, we run the risk of having platelets start to settle and then a clot forming. So that's the function of the endothelial cells, is to keep everything moving. Unfortunately, COVID appears to infect endothelial cells, and it seems to have widespread impact on the blood circulatory system. And many of the severe impacts of the disease are due to that. And many of the long-term effects that are being noticed as well are because the blood vessels are actually being affected by the virus. Okay, so I have a couple more things to tell you about COVID as we go along. By the way, this is the reason there's this appeal to people to wear masks, to stop your own droplets from being expelled into the air, but also to protect you from droplets that are suspended in the air. It's a very simple method of providing yourself with at least some protection from transmission of the virus. Social distancing, we believe that most droplets fall within about 1 meter of the mouth and the nose. So that is the origin of the 6-foot rule, because if each person is expelling droplets and they fall within about 1 meter, that gives you about 2 meters between people, about 6 feet, as being considered a safe distance from one another to prevent inhaling of, as much as possible, prevent inhaling of the droplets. Okay, so the second impact of the COVID is actually a response from the immune system. And unfortunately, in some people, that response is so vigorous that it actually ends up killing the person. This can happen with the immune system. It can go into overdrive and end up actually harming the person rather than protecting them. But we're going to have a talk about how the immune system sees things and how it responds. We've already talked about one arm of the immune system, which was the innate immune system, or the natural immunity. That was that whole story about inflammation and everything else. It's not a specific, generalized response. That is not what we're talking about here. What we want to consider now is what is known as the adaptive immune response. This is the arm of the immune response, which actually learns to respond to very specific antigen and will produce antibody and various specific responses, and then form a memory of that response. So here's what the immune system sees. It sees largely the outside of these viral particles and will begin to respond to them. In fact, it appears that a lot of the immune response is directed here towards these spike proteins that you see sticking out here, but not just to the whole spike protein necessarily, but to very small portions of the spike protein. The immune response is so refined that it will produce a response to many different sites on the spike protein. This spike protein is what is being used to develop most of the vaccines that we are hearing about. Both the vaccines which have come out in the last couple of weeks with very, very, very good results. Both of those vaccines were created based on the structure of the spike proteins. They are producing responses to antigenic portions of the spike proteins. So we need to understand something about the immune response itself in order to understand how a vaccine works, but also what is the course of an illness, of a viral illness in relationship to our immune system. So just briefly again, we have the virus, very simple structure, is a membrane. Embedded in the membrane are viral proteins. On the inside here, there's a protein sheath which protects a nucleic acid genome. All the genes that the virus needs are included here in this nucleic acid strand. Okay, so how does this adaptive immune response work? There are two cells which are really key to to sending information to the lymphatic system to inform it that an adaptive response is required. So if you think about it this way, a lot of what we're going to talk about will happen inside the lymph nodes, but the lymph nodes are quite remote from the rest of the body, right? I mean, if you, for instance, have a viral infection starts in your throat, we have to get the information from the tissues of your throat into the lymph node for an adaptive response to really commence. And that depends on these two cells, macrophages that you've heard about before, and another set of cells called the dendritic cells, which are rather like the macrophages. Both of these cells wander around all of our tissues. They wander around all of our organs, many of them in the skin, all over the body, and they are actually responding to the presence of pathogen. We're not going to talk anymore about the macrophages. They do have a role to play in communicating with the adaptive immune system, but we won't talk about that. The cell that we're really interested in is this one, the dendritic cell. Here is one here. Dendritic means hairy, and you can see why. Okay, here's the dendritic cell. You can see it has all of these extensions, they're hair-like extensions. The dendritic cells are phagocytic. They will eat bacteria, for example, and they will digest it. And then they will put antigenic information out on these hairs. The dendritic cells are also very good at picking up virus. What they do, in fact, is they continually sip. They continue taking little tiny bits of the interstitial fluid. And if they pick up virus or if they pick up bacteria, anything that alarms them, they will digest it and they'll put information. They'll put the antigenic information here on these hairs, and they immediately start to migrate. They find their way to a lymph vessel. They will migrate up the lymph vessel, and they will end up entering the lymph node. And they're doing that so that they can communicate with lymphocytes. Especially, they want the dendritic cells interact with that type of lymphocyte we talked about before, called the T lymphocyte. There are two kinds of T lymphocytes. There are T helper cells and cytotoxic T cells. And dendritic cells communicate with both of them. And they activate them, they tell them this pathogen is present, this pathogen is here. And they try and get the T lymphocytes to do something about it. What they do, we'll hear in a second. Let's go through the types of lymphocytes that we need to, whose function we need to understand. The very first one, and the ones which are going to feature so prominently in this response, are lymphocytes that are called B cells. B cells are important because they represent the pinnacle of the adaptive response, which is that they are going to produce antibody. They are the cells that actually make antibody. And they are going to make antibody, which is very, very specific. It is specific, for example, to one little antigen portion of the spike protein. There are many, many B cells. Each of them will produce one specific antibody. But each B cell that is producing antibody frantically clones itself so that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them. They mature to a big cell called a plasma cell, which goes into circulation in the body and releases antibody throughout the blood circulatory system. So the B cells are lymphocytes. They will ultimately produce antibody. When they do so, they mature to these cells, the plasma cells. They spend most of their time residing in the lymph nodes, waiting to be activated. So each B cell is only going to produce one specific antibody, but once the B cell is informed, your antigen is here, the B cell will clone itself frantically into thousands and thousands and thousands of very active plasma cells. So it produces a large amount of antibody to that specific antigen. The thing is, the body has to have very close control over this response, because antibody is very powerful, very, very powerful. And we can, in fact, if things go wrong, you could start to produce antibody to your own tissues, for example, things like that. This is a very bad situation. So very close control is exerted on the B cells. And that control is affected by the fact that they must be activated. They must be activated by T cells. So here is the link. Here is the link to the rest of the body. And it is this. T cells, the one group, the first group we're going to talk about are the helper T cells. These are the cells, they are lymphocytes. They first of all interact with the dendritic cell. When the dendritic cell arrives in the lymph node, it interacts with helper T cells and it activates them. They are also very specific to one particular antigen, and they become activated and they go and they begin examining all the B cells in the lymph node until they find a matching B cell. And they then activate that B cell. And that B cell now clones itself and releases antibody, which is specific to the antigen that was shown to the T cells by the dendritic cells. It's so clever. You don't want to just be producing antibody which reacts with everything. You want the antibody must react specifically to a specific antigen, and it must only be produced when that antigen is present in the body. The dendritic cell picks up that information from the body somewhere, sees that that antigen is present. It goes to the lymph node. It forms a specific set of T cells that will react with that antigen, activates them. They go and find their matching B cell, and the matching B cell produces antibody to that specific antigen. The plasma cells, mature B cells, can release a massive amount of antibody. But this whole response takes time. It takes 5 to 10 days for you to be, after exposure, for you to be producing the best antibody, the most effective antibody at the highest levels. So there is a gap in time. And that gap is very, very dangerous time. The innate immune system may well be able to keep you going before the production of antibody. But that is a dangerous time, because if the virus or whatever infectious agent is very, very active, it can actually, in that time, establish itself enough to overwhelm the body, and then the immune system is unable to deal with it, and that can be a fatal situation. That is not normally the case. For the vast majority of viral infections, our adaptive response is very, very effective. And once antibody goes into circulation, it will for example, stick all the viral particles together into a clump so that they can be eaten by macrophages and neutrophils. It will gum up the virus so that it cannot function. Because I haven't told you, the one thing I did not tell you is the function of these spike proteins here. These spike proteins are there to stick the virus to the surface of its host cell. And it cannot reproduce unless it first sticks and gets taken into the cell. So if we can produce antibody, which gums up all of the spike protein, the virus can't adhere to the host cell, and it loses its ability to infect. So that's the role of the dendritic cells, T helper cells, and the B cells to produce that antibody. But there's another arm to this adaptive system, and that is that there is this other group of cells which also interact with dendritic cells, and these are called cytotoxic T cells. Cytotoxic, they kill cells. And what the cytotoxic cells are able to do is once they're activated by the dendritic cells, they will go out, they'll go into circulation, and they will try to find cells that are infected with that virus or whatever it was that the dendritic cells have brought information about. They will find infected cells and they will kill them. And so that they terminate the virus's reproduction because they kill the cell that the virus is inside. So we've got those two arms of the adaptive response. But there is a third arm, which is even more important in many ways. And that is that all the way through this response, both B cells and cytotoxic T cells, for example, will form memory. They will leave behind, once the whole response is over, they will leave behind a certain number of very, very long-lived cells, which keep a memory of the whole response. I told you that this response takes about 5 to 10 days to reach maturity. That is quite a long time. We've seen that could actually be dangerous if you're in a very fast-moving infection. Could do a lot of damage before the immune system reaches its peak. So what happens now is that once this initial exposure to this infectious agent is over, the body maintains a memory. It maintains memory B cells and memory T cells, which are very long-lived. And if ever they see this antigen that they responded to here, if ever they see that again, they respond immediately. They respond within hours, not days, not 5 to 10 days, but within hours. And they produce a massive amount of antibody very, 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 very quickly. The person who's had a second exposure to the infectious agent most times won't even know that they've been exposed. Their immune system responds so quickly and so effectively that the infection is dealt with, is eliminated before they even know it. So that is the principle of vaccination. In vaccination, what we hope to do is to teach the immune system how to recognize a particular antigen, so that if ever it sees it again, it will immediately react, not go 5 to 10 days, but immediately react and produce antibody. So that is the idea of the current vaccines. What they are doing is they're using these spike proteins in COVID to teach the immune system what COVID actually looks like, so that if you are ever exposed to the real virus, your immune system will immediately respond by producing masses of antibody, and the COVID virus will not be able to establish an infection. You probably wouldn't even know what was going on. Your immune system would respond so quickly. There are a couple of questions that you'll hear raised if you follow the news. The one question is, there is some difference in the effectiveness of this antibody. It does vary. It varies. There's some variability genetically. For example, some people might produce more effective antibody, others less effective antibody. There's also a question about how long you have this antibody response. In some cases, in some viruses, for instance, measles virus, chickenpox virus, these things, memory is very, very long. You could have a vaccination in infancy and still keep memory for almost the rest of your life. Other cases, and we don't understand why, the memory is sometimes shorter. And there is a question which remains to be answered about COVID. And that is, we've seen that people do produce very strong antibody response to COVID, either people who have been suffered the illness or those people who have been experimentally vaccinated. They produce very strong antibody response to these spike proteins. But we still don't know how long lived the memory is. It certainly appears to be at least months, but there is some concern that it might be a shorter term memory. Okay, so we've done all three arms of that adaptive response. The antibody response, number one, which is also you also see called the humoral response. Then the role of cytotoxic T cells in killing infected cells, and then lastly, very importantly, the maintenance of memory, the establishment and maintenance of memory. Those are the major features of this adaptive response. I will just tell you one other thing. That is, when this response is going on, once the dendritic cells and the macrophages and everything realize that there is an infection, and they get the immune system to start responding, they release a tremendous number of hormones, of immune hormones, which do two things. The first is that they talk to the cells of the immune system and coordinate them. They get all of this interaction is done by hormones, basically. One cell releases a hormone which activates another one, etc. But the immune cells also release hormones which affect the body itself. So, for example, one of the things which happens is that they can raise the temperature of the body, because viruses don't work particularly well at higher temperature, especially, but the immune cells do. They like a higher temperature. They work very well at a higher temperature. That response, that temperature response, can go wrong, and the person's temperature can go out of control. There are also other responses in body. These hormones cause reactions at the site of the infection, for example. They cause inflammation to happen. While the cytotoxic T cells are killing cells, for example, they cause an inflammatory response. If these responses become generalized and out of control, then you can end up actually being extremely ill just from the effects of the immune response. And in fact, in COVID, it appears that many people are actually die as a response largely of their own immune response. And you'll hear about this drug dexamethasone. And dexamethasone, what dexamethasone does is it dampens the immune response. So when medical personnel feel that what they're dealing with in a very ill patient is more the response of the immune system rather than the effects of COVID, they may treat them to dampen the immune system to try and limit the amount of damage the immune system itself does. These are very, very powerful responses by the immune system. And you'll realize, just think about this for a minute. Cytotoxic T cells, just the name itself, cytotoxic cell killing T cells. But you have to have very, very fine control over what those cells do. And indeed, the immune system can go wrong. All right. So here's a summary for you. This is the simple version of a very complicated story, by the way. So we just say dendritic cells wandering around the periphery of the tissues. They find antigen. They find a new antigen of some sort, maybe a virus. Once they realize it's there, they move, the dendritic cells move to the lymph nodes. In the lymph node, they interact with T helper cells and with cytotoxic T cells. The T helper cells interact with B cells and get them to start making antibody to the new antigen. The cytotoxic T cells are activated, they go into circulation and they seek out cells which are infected, with that particular pathogen, which have that antigen associated with them, and they kill them. After a while, this adaptive response usually is so powerful that it will actually wipe out the infection. So it will die, the infection will die down. And at that point, there is an elaborate way in which the body actually stops the immune response, which we won't talk about. It suppresses the immune response so that it doesn't perpetuate. But you may continue, in fact, to produce antibody for quite some time afterwards. But eventually, the amount of antibody that you're producing tails off. But you always maintain memory. You maintain a memory of that entire sequence of events, so that if ever you're exposed to that same antigen, you get an immediate immune response. You don't have to wait that 5 or 10 days. So we'll have a look here, and I'll tell you a little bit just about how an infection proceeds. And this is very typical, especially for viral infection. And we can think of something simple. Just think about getting a common cold, which, by the way, I should tell you, the common cold, if ever anybody asks you, why is there no cure for a common cold? The answer is that there are over 200 different viruses which can produce the symptoms of the common cold, including, by the way, 3 coronaviruses related to COVID, which only cause mild illness, but they cause a cold. At any rate, let's say we're getting a cold. How do you get a cold? Well, you're on the subway, right? And somebody with a cold sneezes down a little way away from you, droplets fly into the air, and you inhale. In addition, many cold viruses will persist on surfaces, like on a table or whatever else. And in fact, it's found that the commonest way to infect ourselves with things like the cold virus is actually through the eye. Rubbing your eye and introducing virus into the mucous membranes of the eye, for example, is a very common way to acquire a virus. So here you get infected. The virus will begin to replicate, will infect cells, get those cells to produce viral particles. The cells liberate the viral particles. Those thousands now of viral particles begin to circulate. They find other host cells in your throat, in your nose, your upper respiratory tract. And now you go into a period, often with a cold, you feel, there is something wrong, but I haven't really got symptoms. I know there's something, I got maybe a vague feeling like I'm going to get a headache, maybe a scratchy feeling in the throat, but nothing really serious. We call this the prodromal period. It's the period when the virus is replicating in your body, but first of all, it hasn't done a huge amount of damage yet, but also very, very importantly, your immune system has not reacted yet. Because a lot of the symptoms that you feel, for instance, with a common cold, a lot of the symptoms you feel actually because of your immune system. Your immune system causes your temperature to rise. Your immune system causes inflammation where the cytotoxic T cells are starting to kill throat cells that are infected with virus. Your immune system causes your nerve endings to become more sensitive to pain, so you start feeling achy. You get that strange scratchy feeling on your skin because your nerve endings become a little bit hypersensitive. All of these unpleasant feelings are actually more due to the fact that your immune system is reacting than due to damage from the virus. The virus is increasing. Your immune system now has been alerted to the presence of the virus. But it takes 5 to 10 days. They say just 5 days here, 6 days, for your immune system to really be able to produce antibody. Here I've drawn a line to show the levels of antibody. However, once it gets going, this actually is a period, this period here, when your immune system is really, really reacting strongly. This is often the period when you feel the most ill. But after a while, you produce enough antibody that you can wipe out the virus. The amount of virus in the body begins to decline until it reaches a point where you no longer feel in illness. The amount of antibody may remain high. You're not necessarily producing more antibody. The antibody actually has a lifespan in your blood circulatory system. By this stage here, your immune system is probably already dampening its response down, but you maintain high antibody levels for quite some time. It just survives in your blood circulatory system. And obviously, the antibody is acting against any remaining virus, preventing it from continuing the infection, and you eventually eliminate it completely. But the antibody will decline, the amount of antibody will decline, but the immune system will maintain a memory of this specific virus, that specific virus. And if ever it sees it again here, if you are reinfected, it will produce antibody like this. It'll produce antibody immediately. And you will never enter that prodromal period or this period of illness, because the memory, once memory is activated, it wipes out the virus immediately. That is the beauty of the adaptive response. It has learned to recognize a particular antigen, and it will react immediately. That's also what we manipulate to produce vaccine. Okay, so let's just think in general. We've actually mentioned quite a few different aspects of immunity. Immunity is the ability to respond to particular antigen. And natural immunity, That is, natural immunity is that arm of the immune system, which is, we talked about inflammation and everything else, is not specific. It's not specific to a particular antigen. It responds to classes of antigen. It sees bacteria and it says, oh, bacterium. It sees fungus, it says, oh, fungus. And it can produce particular responses to classes of antigen, not specific antigen. Acquired immunity is that immunity system that we've just talked about. It's how we acquire knowledge about antigen. It's an adaptive response. The immune system is able to respond to something it has never seen before, react against it, eliminate it, and keep a memory of it so that if it ever sees it again, it'll respond immediately. Here's something else that you will hear about in connection with the COVID crisis, and that is the suggestion that we can go to somebody, for example, who has high levels of antibody still in their blood, and we can extract that antibody from them and actually inject it into somebody else who is ill in order to boost their response. So, for example, in the case of COVID, it appears that, in fact, this period here is really important. The virus can be doing a tremendous amount of damage before the person's immune system begins to respond appropriately. If we can actually come along and artificially give people antibody at this period here, we could offer them some protection from the damage of the virus itself. That is called passive acquired immunity. And it actually, there is a natural form of passive acquired immunity. And that is the immunity which is conferred on an infant. For example, a fetus in the uterus acquires antibody from its mother. It actually can pass across the placenta, and the child can have circulating antibody. So it will have antibody to whatever the mother is currently has antibodies to. In addition, the breastfeeding infant, for example, can acquire antibody through breast milk as well. And this is really important because it takes about 6 to 9 months for an infant to develop a completely functional adaptive immune response. It takes them some time in the first year of life, when in fact they might be in particular danger of being infected with virus, and they acquire antibody from the mother, and that is a passive acquired immunity. But we can, in fact, manipulate that and try and extract antibody from somebody who has recovered from an illness like COVID and give that antibody to somebody who is in the early stages of the illness. Now, I should tell you, this has received a lot of attention in the press and everything. The studies, current studies, are very variable as to the effectiveness of this. Some of them say there is a positive effect, but there are others that say there is no effect. So it's not clear that this actually works for COVID. Okay, so I also hinted at the fact that the immune system can actually go wrong sometimes, and unfortunately it does. And the one time that it goes wrong is when it loses the ability. The immune system is supposed to be able to distinguish what is our own tissue, self, from non-self, like a pathogen, or else a tumor cell, for example, that has changed its nature. That is the main responsibility of the immune system, to distinguish self from non-self. But in some cases, for some reason or another, it begins to go wrong. And it can start to attack our own cells, the cells of our own body. We do not understand why. It is not clear. There seem to be several possible causes. Sometimes, for example, it's thought that the adaptive response is responding, for example, to particular cells that are infected with a virus or whatever. The infection ends and the body keeps on attacking those cells. That is one theory about how it might work. But there are specific autoimmune diseases which we recognize. And I'll just tell you briefly about some of them. And you'll see that they are very, very specific. And there are very specific cells which the immune system is wrongly attacking and causing these diseases. This one here is Addison's disease, is a disease where, an autoimmune disease where the adrenal glands are attacked. And it's also known as adrenal insufficiency. One of the reasons I put it there is it features actually in our history, because this is a disease which President John F. Kennedy suffered from. And it is believed to have had quite an impact on his ability to function as president. This one here, attack on the thyroid cells of the thyroid gland. This is actually one of the commoner autoimmune diseases, and it can have two effects. The one is called to cause an insufficiency, a thyroid insufficiency, or thyroid just doesn't respond properly. This results in hypothyroidism. The other is to cause the tissues of the thyroid to become overactive, and this is hyperthyroidism. Both two contrasting responses to an autoimmune attack. This one, this disease here is a generalized disease of a systemic disease, the word I'm trying to think of. It's a generalized systemic disease, largely associated with inflammatory responses of the blood circulatory system, called lupus erythematosus. This one I'm sure many of you will have heard of. This is multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is due to an autoimmune attack on the myelin sheath. You'll remember the myelin sheath is a sheath of tissue around nerves, which is an insulator. It's around motor nerves, especially, that the myelin sheath gets attacked by the immune system, and this ends up causing all sorts of neurological problems. This one here, this disease is called myasthenia gravis, and this again, I remind you of something, and that is that when a nerve ending terminates at a muscle, it has to release neurotransmitters in order to get the muscle to contract. And the neurotransmitter it releases is called acetylcholine. The muscles have receptors for acetylcholine. The acetylcholine binds to receptors for acetylcholine to cause the muscle contraction. This disease, myasthenia gravis, the autoimmune attack is on the receptors for acetylcholine. So you can release acetylcholine from the nerves, but your muscles simply don't react. So it's a progressive paralytic disease. Pernicious anemia is an autoimmune attack on the processes which produce all our blood cells, especially the red blood cells in the red marrow of the bone. So it's an attack often it's an immune attack against the stem cells that produce all the blood cells. Psoriasis is a very, very common autoimmune disease. If you watch television in the evenings, you'll see 100 ads for treatments for psoriasis. It's a form of eczema, but it also involves often an autoimmune attack on connective tissue, on the joints, things like that. And it causes both unsightly eczema reactions, but it can also cause a crippling arthritis as well, called psoriatic arthritis. So that's psoriasis. Here are a couple more. Rheumatoid arthritis. There are two kinds of arthritis. There's an arthritis of aging called osteoarthritis, which is simply aging of the joints. The cartilage thins, and the joints become inflamed, and etc. But there is a type of arthritis which actually can arise at any age, and it's called rheumatoid arthritis, and it's a reaction of the immune system to components of cartilage. So it sees your own cartilage as being foreign and attacks it, and it can cause crippling diseases of the joints. Scleroderma is an autoimmune disease which causes thickening and toughening of the skin. It's an attack on the fibroblasts. Those are the skin cells which are supposed to remain supple. And it causes an unsightly thickening of the skin. One of the most important of all of the immune diseases is autoimmune attack on pancreatic cells, which those are the cells which normally produce insulin, which regulate our blood sugar. This is a very common cause of type 1 diabetes, and this is often becomes apparent early in development, early in childhood. And again, we don't know why, but it's a very specific attack against one kind of pancreatic cell that produces insulin. The last one I'll mention, because it's also fairly common, is an autoimmune reaction against tissues of the intestine. And we do know that this is often sparked by a reaction because of a gluten reaction. Gluten is a protein which we have particularly in wheat and wheat products in bread. And some people react to the presence of gluten. And one of the ways in which they react is they start an autoimmune response to cells inflamed by gluten. And this produces a condition called ulcerative colitis, literally ulcers in the intestine, or Crohn's disease, which is a very severe form of the autoimmune response. So the last thing that I want to tell you about is one which probably is an aberration of the immune system, which I think probably many of you have at least some experience with. And this is the hypersensitivity. Now, hypersensitivity or allergies are a particular group of responses, some of them very, very complicated, but at its simplest, I express it like this. The immune system is supposed to be able to distinguish self from non-self, that is true, but it's not supposed to produce responses to harmless substances. So if you think of it, for example, grass pollen. Well, what damage can grass pollen do to us? Can't do any damage to us at all. It can't infect us. It can't bite us. Can't do anything. It's just grass pollen, that's all. But our immune system, for some reason, it can sometimes see grass pollen and treat it as if it was a pathogen. What it's doing is it's recognizing something about the grass pollen as being antigenic. It's being antigenic. So an allergen, like grass pollen, is a harmless substance that the body mistakenly recognizes as being antigenic. And so just think, the trouble with this is that it depends all on this one type of cell called the mast cell. Now, you remember I told you, you do any damage to tissue, the very first thing that happens is that we have this group of cells called the mast cells. And the mast cells contain histamine. And as soon as they're stimulated, they release their histamine. And the histamine causes an inflammatory reaction. It causes the blood vessels to dilate. It causes the blood vessels to start to leak. And so just think about this. Okay, if you are allergic to grass pollen, let's say, and you're out walking or whatever, and you pass through a patch of grass pollen which is suspended in the air. What do? You breathe it. You breathe it into your nasal passages, and you get it in your eyes, right? You shouldn't actually react to that at all. There's no reason for you to react, but for some reason, your mast cells see that and think that's a pathogen. And what they do, what the mast cells do, they release their histamine. And what happens to your nose? Well, first of all, your nose blocks up because the blood vessels start to dilate. What happens when the blood vessels start to dilate? They become leaky. The tissues start to swell because there's some leakage of serum into the tissues. It sets up a whole inflammatory response. What about your eyes? Well, your eyes go red. They also start to leak a bit of serum. Your eyes start to tear up because of this inflammation in your eyes. Before you know where you are sniffing, snorting, sneezing, blotting your eyes, etc. And what do you have? You have an allergic response. That is a typical allergic response to the presence of something, which is in effect quite harmless, which is grass pollen. So we can have that is a typical kind of external response. But think about this. What about if you actually get something which begins to circulate in your body? There are two principal ways that this can happen. For example, if you are allergic to a venom, let's say to bee venom or wasp venom, how does a wasp or a bee sting you? They actually inject the venom into you. That venom begins to circulate. It begins to circulate in your body. If you are allergic to that, which is not unheard of, but it's not common. Most people don't have to worry about that. The bee stings you, all you've got to worry about is the pain of the bee sting. People who are allergic, however, to that venom, as that venom begins to circulate, it causes exactly the same reactions. Mast cells all over your body, in all of your tissues, now react. If you are allergic to bee venom, mast cells all over your body release histamine, and blood vessels all over your body start to dilate and start to leak fluid, for example. There are other reactions as well, but those are the most important ones. If all of the blood vessels of your body dilate, what is going to happen to your blood pressure? Your blood pressure is going to plummet, catastrophically plummet, very, very low. At the same time, your blood vessels are starting to leak fluid. You're losing blood, even more blood volume, but that fluid is going to go out. It's going to go out into your organs, such as your lungs. It's going to start flooding your lungs. This is a terribly dangerous situation. It can precipitate within minutes of somebody who is allergic. And this is what we call anaphylaxis, or an anaphylactic shock reaction. It's a systemic release of histamine, which causes all of the blood vessels to dilate and the blood pressure to plummet, along with some other effects as well. So people who know that they are allergic to bee venom, for example, or allergic to penicillin, this might happen if you had an injection of penicillin. It can also happen if you absorb an allergen from the gut, like if you're allergic to peanuts, for example. and you absorb peanut allergen in your gut, you can get the same reactions. People who know that they have these allergies very often wear a bracelet to state that they are. They also very often carry with them a drug in a syringe, which they can inject immediately to dampen this response until they can get to a hospital and be treated properly. In a first aid situation, if you have nothing else and somebody looks like they are suffering anaphylaxis, what you can do is try and give them a hefty dose of Benadryl cough syrup, which, if you can get it down them, will help to dampen the response. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of the immune system. I hope that along with anything else, you learned something useful. And I'll see you again on Friday.